So we are delighted as part of our Wednesday, kind of our Coronavirus Wednesday series, to bring Justin Marceau in to speak with you. He's been a longtime friend of the Nonhuman Rights Project, a longtime associate, of mine. He and I had known each other for a long time. We have co-written an article on habeas corpus in which Justin was kind enough to stick his neck out and be a co-author with me, and had I'm sure to face, and we'll ask him a whole lot of questions from the other co-authors, in the book, as to exactly what the hell is he doing writing an article with me. So that probably ties into some degree with what we're going to be talking about. Justin is a professor at the University of Denver Law School, and he's been involved in a lot of the ag laws, litigation, and in fact, he'll be able to explain what he does a lot better than I. And then he's the author of the book, see if you can tell, on Beyond Cages, Animal Law and Criminal Punishment, and that'll be one of the main things that I want to talk about. In fact, why not just jump into that, and the other things will kind of get to it. So, Justin, I'm just going to start with the first sentence of your introduction,
Great.
Which is, the animal protection movement is living out an untenable paradox motivated by a vision of progressive social reform while relying on regressive social policy. So we can probably spend the entire time just answering that question, but I think that's probably what people are here to hear you talk about.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for everybody. It's always great to work with the Nonhuman Rights Project and Steve, and excited to do so. And I would, we wrote a chapter together back in 2018. It was provocative then, and I think this book is provocative. I should say, by way of context, Steve, I think you and I were, I don't remember the year, you might, but maybe 2016, 2015, we were both in Sundance, the Sundance Film Festival, and there was
2016.
16,
yes.
And there was a screening and some work there. And it was at that point that it dawned on me, actually, that the Nonhuman Rights Project had it has a different approach in many ways. The Nonhuman Rights Project has a different sort of receptivity to social change in general, different sort of way of greeting persons who are viewed as outside of the law. Many of the major law groups in animal law are pretty hostile, and there's reasons to be so, with persons engaged in direct action and civil disobedience. And I was really interested to see Steve just sit down and engage with the humility he brings to these conversations with people who are engaged in all kinds of different forms of advocacy, right? And some who are facing criminal prosecution, including people with DXE. And it sort of sparked something in me, Steve, I have to say, just sort of your engagement that day.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So part of it was looking at the idea that the Nonhuman Rights Project truly looks at this as a civil rights fight, right, and not a fight about how do we prop animals up in the law, promote their welfare at whatever the expense. And that's sort of the thesis of the book, and the sentence that you read. In my mind, we're going to have lots of times for questions, and obviously it's a provocative thesis intentionally, but I think at some level the book makes a point that we all know to be true, or at least at some level know to be true, and it's a small point, right, which is that the implications of investing in the current US criminal justice system, the tough on crime policies of the United States, are not always win-win situations, that it's not always a good thing. In my mind, right, you look at Rattling the Cage, and Rattling the Cage has this, Steve's book, one of Steve's books, has this really brilliant way of illustrating that part of what we're up against is this thick, impenetrable wall where on one side fall the humans and on the other side all the non-humans. And I think in some ways what my book does is say, well, if lawyers in animal law are re-erecting that wall just from a different vantage point, and saying, look, caging and oppression and deprivations of liberty should be celebrated when it comes to certain humans, there is a problem, right? That if we treat human caging as irrelevant to the fight for animal protection, then we're sort of creating another wall, another division that's ultimately not going to play out that well. And so it's the ability, right? I mean, I think that you've always viewed the wall as a bit porous, Steve, and that's why I referenced the Sundance Film Festival. I mean, Steve has engaged with groups and activists that other organizations just won't even touch or engage with, right? Which is fairly interesting to me.
Well, so what is exactly the paradox, and why is it untitled?
Good. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, I guess what I try to do in the book, right, and it takes a while, but is set out the scope and the nature of the animal movement's not exclusive, but interest in criminal punishment, right? And so the paradox here, I guess that's why I say beyond cages, is an emphasis on prosecuting, an emphasis on, for example, incarcerating juveniles, an emphasis on, it was just in the last few years that animal protection groups filed amicus briefs in support of incarcerating juveniles in the high courts across the country for animal cruelty, right? Would you imagine that donations to animal protection would support efforts to scapegoat or deport citizens under the Trump administration, right? Would it be something that you would imagine would be part of animal advocacy, is having someone forcibly deported or legal briefs filed in support of that? So there's a number of layers and textures to it, but the basic argument is that if the movement wants to be perceived as a civil rights organization, if the movement wants to be perceived as something that is on the progressive vanguard and trying to knock down walls that impose barriers to sort of human compassion and empathy, to broaden the reach, we can't be overly invested in policies and tactics that we've taken for granted, frankly, right? I mean, and I'm as guilty as anyone of that, right? That we take for granted the idea that, it would be a net gain for animals. And it really is all about animals, right? And some people might say, well, this is an anthropocentric project. It's about animals, right? I mean, what is ultimately going to produce the most good for animals, the non-humans in the world? Is it going to be through pro-prison type projects, or is it going to be through something that puts us in alignment with civil rights organizations and the efforts they're pursuing?
Well, this may be obvious, but it may not be obvious to some people, which is, what's wrong with the current criminal system so that animal protection groups shouldn't really work on like thrusting people into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. I mean, it's a long, that is a very long conversation. I mean, I guess, I'd be happy to take lots of thoughts and questions on this, but I mean, in a nutshell, I mean, there's a reason that the United States is the world leader in incarceration of humans, right? At points, we've incarcerated 2, 3, 4 times the rate of other peer countries. We have roughly, one out of we're the only nation to have entered the 700 club, which is the 700 per 100,000 incarcerated. And I think, in the book, I do a lot to show what these alliances with other groups mean when we talk about some of the themes that you drive upon, Steve, class, race, and other barriers to sort of success in society. These become relevant, right? It seems like, well, that's not animal protection, and I think it's not animal protection in a sense, right? Human rights are not animal rights in the strictest sense. But the question is, well, what does advocacy do that is focused on pro-prison or pro-prosecution policies? And I mean, my ultimate take, right? It's set out for 100 pages, is that if you think I mean, to put it in its most simple form, there is absolutely no data to suggest that incarceration is deterring any crime, much less animal cruelty crime. The investment is heavy. We are not seeing any returns from it in any sphere. And in fact, the best data from the National Science Foundation suggests that for each additional year of incarceration, we would see 4 to 7% increases in recidivism. That is to say, whatever benefit we're getting by putting someone in prison, we see that offset by higher rates of crime in those communities and when the person is released. I mean, there's lots there, right? But I don't want to get too into the criminology data at the moment.
Well, if I remember from reading your book, there was also the issue and the extent of it I wasn't aware of. It's like what happens when certain people get enmeshed into the criminal system. It essentially, ruins their lives forever. And the question is, do we want to be involved in ruining people's lives as opposed to doing something else?
Right. I mean, yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, I tell a lot of stories. There's a lot of qualitative and quantitative data in the book. But, I mean, you can define animal rights differently and what it takes, right? I mean, J.M. Cutsey uses this term, the sympathetic imagination, and Laurie Gruen talks about entangled empathy. What does it mean? How do we best engage this world to teach them that, an elephant in a zoo in Connecticut should not be giving rides for $4 or whatever the instance may be, right? Being driven up north, I think you said, in a Volkswagen van, right? I mean, these are how do we convince people that their empathy should extend to these other creatures? For persons who are trying to organize at the community level, to come in and say, well, look, we ought to be caring a little bit about habeas for animals. It's really jarring if those same communities are saying, well, my uncle, my father, my brother, none of them, they can't even be licensed as a hair cutter or as an HVAC repairman because they have been entangled in the criminal justice system. And your motto is, go to jail if you abuse an animal. There's this sense that the animal law movement is a tough on crime movement, right? And so the number of people that I've met that are sort of immigration advocates, that are criminal justice advocates, that are poverty advocates, that are doing lots of social justice work, that say, wow, I never thought of animal rights as caring about people. And it's not that we have to sort of front load that or make that the funding priority. You have to sort of be cognizant of what happens, right? That these people who are being prosecuted, animals may not be safer, but what happens is that the communities are more set up to distrust and dislike the animal rights effort. And that's true, not just at the level of sort of, okay, my father was, lost his license for whatever as a collateral consequence, but it's true at the scholarly level, right? I mean, when I go to people and say, well, what about supporting Steve Wise's work? What about supporting the effort for habeas for non-human animals? People say, oh, well, aren't they the ones that are pushing for higher felony laws in New York this year? Aren't they the ones that want more cages for humans? There's a dissonance, right? And you can say, well, that's just speciesism. That's just speciesism playing out among, civil rights lawyers. And certainly there's probably some of that. But there's also a piece of it, which is how can we invest our limited resources and our credibility in trying to fight a system that we've come to find unjust if we think this Non-Human Rights Project is supporting criminal law? And I say, well, no, that's not what the Non-Human Rights Project does. It's, yeah, but the animal rights stuff is all, isn't it all like, abuse an animal, go to jail? Isn't it all, we need another felony bill. Oh, we need to update the felony bill. We need to talk about this and that. And it's a real concern, right? And so I've been doing a lot of outreach, and part of the thing, the chapter that we wrote, Steve, we wrote it in a compendium of the 25th anniversary of exonerated persons, right? And so I was asked to write about habeas corpus for exonerated persons, and I invited Steve to join, and we wrote this chapter about habeas for non-humans. And the number of people, right, it's finding these crossover audiences, the number of people who have sort of come forward and said, wow, I was reading this book to have a context, to have a better flavor for what it means to advocate for humans. And I never thought about this animal lens, right? But it does make sense in this context. It fits in that context. And so in some sense, right, I mean, when we're trying to figure out who are the people that we aren't reaching with our message, who is it that's disregarding an animal rights agenda as fringe, you have to imagine there's a lot of people out there that are working sort of in the trenches of civil rights that just haven't thought about the work that you're doing, the work that we're all thinking about, and sort of making these connections. So I view the book, I mean, obviously I get a lot of heat from people who are animal rights people, and I'm happy to take that. But the book is just as much a challenge to civil rights lawyers, right? If you look at passages, I mean, I'd be happy to read a passage at the end if you want, but it says essentially, look, the civil rights lawyers are out there trying to free their clients from solitary confinement. How do they do that? They write things that says, you shouldn't put an animal in a cage like this. Sort of they are re-erecting the wall themselves, right? And so throughout the book, I call out civil rights lawyers for doing this hard-fought work, but ignoring the plight of animals. And then I call out the animal movement for saying we need to cage more humans. So it's sort of an opportunity to put these two camps in conversation more than anything else.
Well, I know the first time I really realized this when I started approaching you to see if you could help enlist habeas corpus scholars to work with us. And because I thought, well, we characterize ourselves as a civil rights organization for non-human animals, and we're working on habeas corpus. And then I learned from you that people weren't all that excited about it because they thought that we were part of an animal rights movement that undermined what they cared about. And when you came back and you're saying, well, I found two, I think now you found three habeas corpus scholars, all great people who can do it. That is great, and we're hoping to be able to bring more habeas corpus scholars in order to help educate the judges before whom we appear on habeas corpus.
Right.
So that was really, though, when you came back and said, I'm having trouble finding people, I didn't know why. I couldn't understand why. Because civil rights, it was habeas corpus. How come we're not all in this together?
Exactly. No, I mean, it's an interesting thing, right? I mean, when I can tell, I mean, imagine, right, to caricature the sort of barrier you're running up against. I mean, imagine if on Monday the judge goes into court and takes her docket, and her docket is a case where there are protesters outside calling for a maximum penalty because there's been a blog post about it, and there's an amicus brief submitted by lawyers saying, this 15-year-old needs to be charged as an adult and sentenced to adult prison. And she's grappling with those issues, and she still hasn't sorted it out. And then on Wednesday, you come into court and say, this animal is entitled, this non-human is entitled to habeas corpus, right? And here come some people to file briefs. It looks from her vantage point and from the vantage point of the sort of habeas scholar that's watching remotely that there's like, the animals don't actually care about humans, right? That it's all one-sided, right? That habeas corpus can be weaponized in pursuit of non-human aims, but we should have briefs from legal scholars supporting greater incarceration as long as those people like animals, right? I mean, there's lots of amicus briefs signed by any number of animal law people that say longer incarceration, and the judges read that, and then they get a brief from you that says, and by the way, habeas for animals too, right? And I think that's a bit jarring, right? It sort of puts them on their heels. They say, well, what is going on here? But yeah, I mean, in one sense, right, it's not entirely inconsistent. I will say, I mean, people often say, well, but the humans are guilty. Of course, that's not always true. That's not the way that our system works, right? They're detained pre-trial. There's lots of detention without guilt, as the habeas cases in Guantanamo and elsewhere prove, with just pre-trial detention generally. But there are differences, right? And some people would say, well, that's why we need to prioritize human habeas, and that's why some of us would say, well, no, we should actually prioritize non-human habeas, right? There's differences. It's not to equate, but the comparison I think is important.
Well, I suspect a lot of people who are listening to you might then think, well, what's the alternative? What happens if the folks in the animal protection movement stop pressing for more felonization of animal abuse, or for longer sentences for those who've been convicted of it? Where are they supposed to go? What are their alternatives?
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, I think there's at least two things that I would point to, maybe three. one is, I mean, and these are projects that will unfold over time, but I mean, one is somewhat less directly related to your organization, but in the general realm, and that's sort of pursuing structural reform rather than individual blame, right? So why don't we look to corporate accountability rather than looking to who is this bad individual, right? And so, to give an easy example of that, New York has been for years, there's been this battle to have Bella's Bill, you have increased felony penalties and these sort of things. And just down the road from the headquarters of the ASPCA is, a foie gras factory that conservatively tortures to death 500,000 birds a year. So if that facility, right, and I mean, I would challenge anyone to read New York's Animal Cruelty Code and say that what is happening to produce force-fed foie gras does not meet the definition of animal cruelty. Now you could say, well, it's not the most severe animal cruelty, but the idea that it doesn't meet the definition of New York animal cruelty, I don't think any lawyer would come to that conclusion. And so you have corporate cruelty just, down the road from, the headquarters where we are going to press individual liability for persons who are going to be blamed. Right. The other thing I would say is these prosecutions of individuals instead of corporations, it's exactly what industry and zoos and researchers want the movement to do. They want us to point the finger at the bad guy, right? Here's the Michael Vick. Everybody look at him. Everybody scoff, make dog chew toys, right? Get very angry at this individual and don't look over here at this shiny roadside zoo or this factory farm that's just down the street from you, right? It's very powerful. If you wanted to have a sort of disruptive operation, this is what you would do, right? You would target people at the 16-year-old who has made a bad decision and say, well, this is public enemy number one. So in addition to the sort of focusing on structural change, I would also say one of the things that we can do is just think about, the role of supporting what I said before, sympathetic imagination. How do we connect all of the science of sentience and cognition that you and others have been harvesting and bringing to the realm, right? My friend Mark Beckhoff often says, there's not a shortage of science that shows about animal suffering, about animal intelligence, about animal laughter, about all of these things. The shortage is on connecting it to the law, connecting it to policy, getting people to care about that science, right? And so as lawyers, as people concerned with animals, we want to think about ways to connect the science to law and policy. And one way to do it is what the Nonhuman Rights Project is doing, of course, right? I mean, I don't know if anybody has marshaled the body of, I don't think so, the body of science that you all have in support of these cases. Win or lose, right, you've changed the conversation because people are talking about the work, leading work of primatologists and other researchers, right? I mean, that's part of it. And I think that the on-the-ground organizers that I was talking about at Sundance, they deserve a lot of credit too, right? They are getting people on the street to say, wow, to engage with issues, right? They're trying to connect them to this. And so as lawyers and as policymakers and as just thinkers in the street, I think a big part of what we have to do is imagine the types of narratives that connect people to the science, right? What increases our empathy towards these creatures? What do we do that helps us see them as something other than ours to use and exploit for entertainment and the like?
One of the things I found interesting in your book was there seemed to be some kind of a relationship between the folks who were trying to get stiffer cruelty statutes, that they entered into some kind of a devil's pact, implicit or explicit, with the legislature to then exempt farmed animals or normal agricultural practices, from the cruelty statute. And of course, there you're exempting 95% of the non-human animals who are probably suffering the most, in order to kind of felonize the other 5%. Yeah. Over the last 30 years, when I've been giving talks, even before I knew you, people would ask me about the anti-cruelty statutes, and I would tell them, well, from where I see it, we're slowly coming to a point where you can do anything you want to most non-human animals, but if you do something bad to a dog or cat, they're going to put you in jail and throw away the key. And that's where we're heading.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right, Stephen. I mean, I appreciate that point. I mean, I give the example in the book. I mean, we could talk about this all day right now with the depopulation efforts right across the country. Depopulating, I mean, one of the worst euphemisms that I have come across, and I've seen a lot when you do animal work, right? We're depopulating by the millions animals, meaning we're killing them, right? There was something in Minnesota where they're putting pigs in wood chippers to make them more readily available for fertilizer, right? After shooting them or causing other forms of killing. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I noted New York, and the reason I pointed to foie gras is that New York is one of the few states that doesn't have this exemption. And it's just interesting because we celebrate the animal criminal law, right? Some people would say, well, this is the centerpiece of animal law. It's like, if we don't have the criminal law, what would we have? And New York, by many measures, would be the great standard bearer because it doesn't even have this exemption. It's one of the few states, right? Henry Bergh brought the law, and then we didn't carve in an exemption. It's so good. And yet, right, the reality is, and this is sort of the 2 points here in one, prosecutors don't pursue this, and the animal groups don't pressure them to pursue prosecutions of industrialized or structural violence because they don't have the support to do so. One second, come here. Okay,
Sure.
My daughter just really wanted you guys to see her panda, so.
Oh, what a gorgeous panda!
But they don't support those types of prosecutions. And I think part of the reason that you don't see support for those types of prosecutions is that those are politically dangerous, right? And again, it's risky. If you say, let's go blame this one guy, like you said, there's no real danger in that. There's no harm, right? Nobody feels confronted. Nobody feels challenged. And the second thing I will say is that the cruelty exemptions, just like you said, it's one of the sad stories of animal criminal law, and I sort of map it out in the book. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's really what you said. I did some interviews with people at 2 different organizations who were involved in the lobbying, and they sort of acknowledged that it was a wink and a nod, right? They knew that they were going to get a felony provision in a state if they acquiesced and didn't make noise about the fact that all industrial farming exemptions an industrial farming exemption would be added to the cruelty code. So it's really quite striking. And then, those people wouldn't go on the record for the sake of their jobs. But I did go through and just trace the legislative history. So, in almost all of the modern enactments of the exemption, in the same year, even in the same bill, you also see the felony law coming in, right? So we had a press release saying it's a great day for animals. We now have felony animal cruelty in the state of South Dakota. And what we didn't mention is, in part 2 of the statute now says, thank goodness, no factory farm can ever be held criminally liable. Right? It was part and parcel. It was the same statute. So yeah, I mean, this zeal for wins is understandable, right? It's hard to get wins, as we all know, from these judges in these legislatures. But we've been willing to make some trades here that are not good for the whole of the animal protection effort.
You and I exchanged a few emails because I was asking you whether you knew of any states in which that didn't have an anti-cruelty exemption, whether any prosecutions had been brought.
Such a great question. I mean, I think I said no. I was going back through in my notes for my book. I found a couple. So there was HSUS prompted an investigation in 2017 that was pretty notable for a Prop 2 violation. So the sort of ban on battery cages in raising hens. The hens had to be allowed to spread their wings. HSUS was able to get an investigation in, I think it's, I'm forgetting the county, but it's the same county where they brought the Hallmark investigation. So there was a sympathetic district attorney, but they are very, very few and far between, right? And I mean, that's why I say I was at a presentation of an animal law conference where they sort of documented a prosecution against 4 individual workers and, terrible things, kicking animals, beating them as they're moments away from slaughter. Terrible. None of us would tolerate it. It's grotesque. But these people are truly at the sort of bottom rung of the social ladder, and that they didn't have any other jobs. Some of them were renting social security numbers, and then their faces were posted all over Facebook as animal abusers, even though some of them were never accused of animal cruelty. They were accused of immigration offenses, and then they were deported, and these sort of things, right? And then my question was, well, by my reading of the criminal statute in state X, there was corporate liability. Why didn't we pursue the corporation? I said, well, that's corporate liability is a different beast. We don't, it's different. And to me, right, the law is not worth the paper it's written on if we're not really to go after the structural players, the players who are creating systemic violence. We're only willing to target sort of the easy, low-hanging fruit of persons who are going to be deported.
Well, that was one of the things that caused me to form the Nonhuman Rights Project. Was I was working as an animal protection lawyer for 5 years, 10 years, and it became clear to me that there was a paradox or dilemma. I'm not sure, but that the only cases that I could win were ones that really didn't matter.
Right.
And that the more I moved towards things that mattered, the more the resistance stiffened, until when it really mattered, I didn't have a chance in the world using the process as it was. And that's when it began to dawn on me that the only way in which non-human animals their interests were ever going to be protected would be if they were persons who were seen as being eligible for fundamental rights that we could then enforce as we would for human beings.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's an astute observation, right? I mean, one of the things that I've noted is that many of the sort of mainstream animal law groups have been just, very upset by the claim that criminal law isn't an important part of their work, or that it diminishes them. But those same groups don't really quibble with animal law scholars who have said it's okay to imagine animals as property. It's okay to imagine them as property, and as property we could, treat them better. We could, eat them sometimes. We could, there's this sort of disconnect where we're getting victories in criminal law, and they must be big victories, right? Because they get headlines. But if we're willing to sort of go bigger, like you said, it's, they're sort of like, well, that's dangerous stuff, right?
Well, so thank you very much for liking what the Nonhuman Rights Project does. How about organizations like DXE? Where do they fit into this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. That's who I didn't know if you wanted to put them by name on this. I think that their work plays an absolutely critical role in the movement, right? I mean, I know that it's I was just visiting at Harvard Law School this semester. As you know, we were going to come out and visit and couldn't because of COVID. But, I had a number of great people, including the Nonhuman Rights Project, speak to a large class of students at Harvard Law School. And these law students who are so engaged, so interested in how do we really make the change, the next level of change, they were really interested in the work of the Nonhuman Rights Project. They'd heard from all these different groups from the Nonhuman Rights Project and DXE, right? And there's a reason that DXE connects with people, right? We have this narrative in the movement that what we're doing is we're trying to help animals as victims, but we isolate and don't provide any thing except hostility towards DXE. I think that the work that Wayne and other people are doing plays exactly into the political theory of the radical flank. And by that I mean, you have to have a certain cadre of the outlaw to have success in law, right? I mean, there's been no social movement in history that I'm aware of where you don't have some people that are oppressing direct action, engaging in property crimes, engaging in small level things like trespass for what they believe in, that then everyone else can point to and say, well, look, Your Honor, we're not them, right? I mean, we're trying to work within the law here. So I think that they play a really important role in this ecosystem, right? I mean, the things that that's part of my critique of the animal law movement's focus is, one, it's distracted us away from where most suffering occurs. And two, it has isolated groups like the Nonhuman Rights Project and DXE that are doing things that are more radical. And I think that both of those are critical missteps.
That's interesting because I've been a supporter of DXE from the beginning. Whenever I'm in the Bay Area. I go to Berkeley and I give a talk at the Berkeley Animal Center. I was giving talks before there was a Berkeley Animal Center to DXC. I've known Wayne for a long time. You have to admire his determination and guts. Even if you don't like him for many reasons. I haven't been one of the people who for some reason doesn't like him. I know I think one of the issues is it's so decentralized that when something bad happens within the organization, you don't know who to blame. And Wayne ends up getting blamed because he's really the face of DXC, whether he wants to be or not, even if he doesn't know what's going to happen. And don't bother sending me things telling me all the terrible things that have been done at DXC. I don't know whether they have or not, but I know as an organization, I agree with you. As someone, for example, who's behind me, I must have 150 books on slavery and abolition. I'm well aware of how in the United States the abolitionist groups worked, and you do have the people. I mean, you had John Brown, for example, who's a lot worse than DXC. But John Brown turned out to be this extraordinary catalyst, for the Civil War and during the Civil War. I don't think, as a member of the bar, neither you nor I can really participate in what DXC is doing, or we won't be members of the bar very long. But that doesn't mean we can't, from a historical point of view and a philosophical point of view, say that there are places for everybody, and we don't see at least I don't see DXC as being outside. I see them kind of anchoring one end of it.
Right. No, I think we're in the same spot. I mean, I guess I would challenge the listeners or anyone around the country to say, right, I mean, what we're doing when we prosecute someone who injures a stray cat is protecting animal victims. But when we, sort of say DXC is a fringe group of nutcases when they're saving baby pigs who are literally dying in their own filth, all video recorded, right? I mean, that they are sort of, not helping animal victims, right? I mean, there's sort of the lines we draw. And I mean, that's a very common and salient, well-accepted line among animal lawyers, right? Is criminal prosecution. I've had lawyers tell me that criminal prosecution is direct action for animals, and that almost all other animal law is irrelevant, right? But what do you think you get from the prosecution? Let's say we get a 6-year sentence tomorrow for some guy. Do you think that means that guy, when he comes out of prison, is going to be better to animals? Is that what we believe? Do you think his community suddenly has learned and there will be no more of that? What is it that we think we're getting? And then what do you think is happening with the messaging that a group like DXC is sending? No, I think you're absolutely right.
Well, so one of the things in your book is that you are comparing what the animal protection movement does with respect to the criminalization of these with other with other movements, like the movement to try to step in and stop domestic abuse, and how that went through kind of a similar cycle that that we're going through, and yet the results were not all that great.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a great read. I mean, so the nutshell version is that, right, we're not the first social movement to say, wow, we're really getting screwed in the law, and what could we do? And we say, well, I think what we need is we probably need to look a little bit more mainstream, and we need to have the prosecutors on our side. If the police and the prosecutors are on our side, then surely we're winning, right? And there's a lot of examples of that, right? But one that I think is quite persuasive is the move of feminists and domestic violence, interpersonal violence, right? So the legal scholarship, I mean, of course, there's not consensus. There's no consensus within the animal rights movement, right? But there are a lot of leading feminist legal scholars at this point who decry the efforts, even if they were part of them at the time, to use criminal law to bring its force and sort of make it clear that domestic violence wasn't a family matter. And the reason that they regret that now is the impacts that it has had on their communities, and that now we have non-reporting, right? So there's empirical data about who's not reporting, who's not coming forward, who's afraid that they didn't actually want this person to go to jail, they just wanted to be safe, who's afraid that they're not reporting because they didn't want this person to be sent out of the country, they just wanted to be safe. So it's much more complicated than we think. And so I guess one of the takeaways that I try to say, and I say this to the civil rights movement as well, right? I mean, as I say, the book is written for animal people, but it's just as much for people who think that criminal law can help us solve thorny social problems, whatever they may be, right? And it just doesn't work. It's easy to get police and prosecutors on board and say, you're right, we need this guy to go to jail. Because that's what they do. For a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Yeah, more jail, it'll work. That doesn't mean that that police officer or those prosecutors are suddenly sympathetic to feminism, right? You bring another bill that says we ought to have some sort of equal pay act, and they're all opposed to it, right? They're in favor of the incarceration because we've gotten ourselves into a system that repeats itself and regenerates itself and creates these hierarchies. But it doesn't mean that by incarcerating someone, suddenly those people are going to be animal lovers, right? They're going to believe that Tommy should be freed. Quite the opposite. Those people will come out and try to prosecute ag-gag laws. They'll try to, say, this isn't what we need. We've already got a cruelty law, right? Look at the results in your cases in Connecticut and New York, right, where I mentioned in the book, where the courts are coming out and saying, well, the Nonhuman Rights Project has told us it brought an interesting claim, but hey, in New York, we've got a felony law, right? Why is he bringing this, right? Things aren't so bad for captive animals, right? If anything goes wrong, we'll prosecute somebody, right? It's this sort of bait and switch that I think is very dangerous.
Yes. Well, look, we've been going for almost 45 minutes. We have 15 more minutes to go, and I'm hoping that folks out there have questions for you. So, Nikki, can you ask them?
Sure, absolutely. So I've opened up the chat for questions. So if anyone has them, please feel free to type them in and I will go ahead and ask. And while we're waiting, here's one from that came in through the social media. So it is, let me start again. What are the obstacles or opportunities that the COVID crisis presents for bringing together human and non-human animal interests?
Yes, that is the million-dollar question, right? I mean, I defer to the sort of visionaries like Steve for that, right? I mean, I'm an academic that sort of chips away at things. I mean, I will say, I think that COVID gives us opportunities. I'm interested in what you think, Steve, but I think COVID gives opportunities in transparency and also sort of just an acknowledgement that conditions in facilities where animals are raised for food result in health hazards and labor hazards, right? So again, people often ask me when I was litigating the ag-gag cases in particular, say, well, why doesn't the animal rights movement join forces with the labor movement? It seems so powerful, it seems so palatably correct that there are human rights violations occurring when they're speeding up these line speeds and doing all this stuff, making people work in the midst of COVID, having executive orders declaring meat an essential commodity. But how are we not more aligned with them? And the last time I got that email, I just sent a screenshot of an organization's page where they had just sought prosecution of 6 of the meatpacking plants labor union members for an abuse scandal, right? It's very hard to blame these individual workers, right? Upton Sinclair was documenting this a century ago. Very hard to blame these individual workers and then turn around and say, hey guys, we'd like you to write a brief for us and talk about the horrors of factory farms. Like, you guys are on the front lines, couldn't you help us? And then they say, well, last week you wanted to prosecute us and you were actually trying to turn us state's evidence against our union members. So, I mean, my hope is that some of this COVID crisis will serve as, an opportunity to recognize bridges, right? That we could say the industrial agricultural market is essentially sweatshop labor. It's bad for humans, it's bad for non-humans, so on and so forth. And to maybe impose greater regulations through another administration that require veterinary true neutral oversight in ways that it's unimaginable now. But I think there's a lot of thinking there. Steve, have you thought that through?
Well, the Nonhuman Rights Project has a whole list of things that Lauren Choplin has written that kind of sets out our position. I was just looking at it. It goes on for like 3 pages of how we deal with it. So I will not
wow.
go on.
That's great.
One of them is that we note that the exploitation of non-human animals really lies at the root of the COVID crisis. That what we do to them then turns around and they do it to us. And to me, it's the most transparent or the most obvious when you're looking at the workers in the slaughterhouses who are getting COVID. You know, it's you know, we, not they, but I mean, we human beings are treating non-human animals in a certain way, and the COVID right there, it's coming, you know, from the bodies of the animals right back to the humans. To me, that is, you know, clear. We talk about the fact that one of the ways in which we are dealing with each other is to quarantine. And in fact, we plan on talking about it in oral argument, probably sometime in the coming months, when we're talking to judges and saying, you know, we've been trying to explain to you, you know, what Happy the elephant feels like, who's been forced to sit on an acre of land, you know, for the last 40 years. And I'll bet you didn't like sitting in your office and you aren't able to go anywhere. You don't have any social life. You know, your autonomy is being undermined because, well, for a lot of reasons, but the feelings that you have are not far from the feelings that our non-human animal friends are having. If they're elephants, if they're chimpanzees, you know, if they're orcas, if they're those kinds of non-human animals who are cognitively complex enough, you know, to feel lonely, you know, to feel abused, to feel like they don't have any choices in the world. So, yeah. Judge, when you're thinking about what we're telling you, we'd like to have you perhaps more easily and better imagine what they must be feeling, and to have you, I think, in some way get a little bit of the urgency that we have, that our clients need some kind of respite. They need a remedy, and you can't just be involved in abstract ideas. Well, why don't you go to the legislature? Well, you mean so they can suffer for 10 or 20 or 30 more years? We ask you to rethink that. And then we talk about the fact that the COVID and our response to it shows that we're living in this world in which there's an interconnectedness, and we're seeing the interconnectedness in the natural world. And I think perhaps, you know, as a matter of general policy, people need to take that into consideration more than we have been. I think people might feel that now. It remains to be seen that when people start to calm down and we move back into a more or less normal life, whether this will seem like it was in the past and it's really not a problem anymore, or whether they take it with them and they want to change the world. Because you read things and you find that pandemics not infrequently lead to great social changes. Is this going to be one of those times, or is this not going to be one of those times? So that's part of what
yeah, I mean, just this morning, I think Chris Green at the Harvard Animal Law Program sent out a link of, I think Wuhan has banned the sale of live animals now, and there's a national plan in China to buy out farmers. I think they want to do away with the consumption of exotic animals. So yeah, I mean,
it's terrific. Okay, Mickey, who's next?
Yeah, great. So Barbara asks, what is your solution to prevent animal cruelty if we move away from incarceration? So what is the alternative?
Yeah, good. I mean, it's a super hard question, right? I mean, it's going to take, I mean, that's why I think Steve's question about DXE is so good. It's going to take a full spectrum. Nothing is easy, right? Would the civil rights movement have happened without the original, you know, I think it was 3 sitting at the lunch counter in Woolworths in North Carolina, 1960? I mean, maybe, right? But you don't know which pieces are essential. And I think what I'm saying is the investment in resources, even if it's only a plurality of the resources in incarceration, isn't going to work. I would focus on civil rights orientation. I would focus on habeas corpus. I would focus on anything that is trying to speak for the animals in a way that is consistent with a theme of social change and civil rights, as opposed to looking like animals are different, they should be out of the cages, and humans need to be in. And like I said, I think that looking at challenges to systemic structural violence, liability for zoos, liability for factory farms, that is possible. You don't have to even have people in jail. And we know that corporate behavior changes when they face liability. Right? This is a real thing. And so to me, the fact that we're so interested in a win, and you know, felony makes a little difference here. An incarceration of an individual it impedes our efforts. It distracts us from going after the corporations that are really creating mass abuse. I mean, put differently, but imagine that the focus on animal abuse, as Steve said, which exempts basically everything except pets in most states in the US. If every household in the US was abusing a pet every year, we would end up at, I think there's 120 million households. We'd end up at 120 million animals hurt. That is nothing compared to just the animals that by industry's count suffer to death, right? Not that are slaughtered, but that starve or die of something, get trampled on delivery. Right? It's well north of 150 million. So, I mean, it's focusing our resources. Now, what are those causes of action? I have some theories, some things to work on, but we don't have all the answers, right?
Well, as we see it, short-term wins are usually not that helpful.
Can actually hurt.
Yeah. So what we try to do is, first of all, what we do, and I think others should do too, is you come up with a long-term strategy. And we've been using a long-term strategy over one that looks ahead decades. We've been using it for almost a decade now, and we're just kind of continuing to follow it. And we don't do anything in a case that might allow us a short-term win at the expense of the long-term strategy. So for example, we don't try to turn our rights case into a welfare case. It's the pressure's on you sometimes to kind of give up what you're doing and try to turn it into a welfare case in some way, though we've never seen how that can really help. And we would actually do something in the interest of our clients because we view them as if we had human clients, but we always have to keep our eye on the ball. What's the whole purpose of this? And part of that is trying to work with media too, which because those of us who deal with media know that when we walk out of the courtroom or the judge makes a decision, they say, well, did you win or did you lose? Oh, okay, you won, you lost. And what we say is, well, actually, we won even though we lost. And sometimes that's really hard for people to understand. In fact, there's a book I have written by a civil rights lawyer called, I think it's called Victory Without Winning. And that's what we engage in. We plan to win, but first you have to gain victories without winning before you can actually win.
Yeah, no, and yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, Doug Najami has written "Winning by Losing." It's not this is not a myth, right? Somebody did ask me in the private chat just about how do you impose corporate criminal liability without going after individuals. Happy to talk about that more by email. Corporate liability, like all forms of legal questions, are state law questions typically, right? So the last time I looked at it, it was Colorado. I've also looked at New York. It varies by state, but so for example, in Colorado, that's just the last statute that was on my mind because I looked at it a few weeks ago. In Colorado, a corporation can be charged for the acts of persons. There's no case law saying anything contrary to the plain text of the statute, charged for the acts of persons done in the name of that company. It's actually quite broad and quite permissive, right? There's no question that a company producing something that was harming animals and they didn't have a cruelty exemption could be prosecuted under a Colorado model statute. There's nothing in New York, for example, that says, well, if the corporation approves something that is unnecessarily injuring or maiming an animal, the corporation wouldn't have liability. It's quite the opposite, right? There's sort of it's agency law and who is responsible. You have a responsible person making actions as opposed to rogue actors at the low level. So corporate liability is not, impossible to find in many of these cases where there's investigations. Now, the related question is, how do you do that without bringing down the individuals too, or having the scapegoating? And that's just a question of prosecutorial discretion and our choices, right? You can if there is corporate liability, there's almost always individual liability, and then it's just a matter of where do you point the prosecutorial weapons.
Okay, what's our next question?
Hey. Sure. So do you see promising legal advances internationally? Is there a country that provides a positive model for the US to aspire to?
I mean, I bet Steve knows that and answers to that better than me. I think there's always, what I would say is, I think there are positive things in the US in terms of what courts have said about Steve's cases and others. And I think there are, I mean, there are nations that have things that say animals aren't property. Does that change the game, or does it just allow a semantic shift, right? I'm not sure that I would point to one country as getting it right fundamentally, but I'm always interested in comparative perspective. Steve, you've been all over.
Yeah, we work with lawyers, and we're helping them bring cases within the next year in India, in Israel. It'll be the first case in Israel. Likely, it'll be filed in the Israeli Supreme Court. The law in India seems to be ahead of everybody else with the Nagaraja case from 2014, saying, at least on paper, that all non-human animals have statutory and constitutional rights. As American lawyers, when we went over there, we said, "Oh, come on! Are you telling me that a decision that gives mosquitoes rights and elephant rights, what we think that's going to mean is that nobody really gets any enforceable rights?" So we're trying to work with Indian lawyers to bring more of an American type case, in which we're not trying to get all rights for everybody. We're simply trying to get a single right for single non-human animal. Can that be done? And then we work with folks in Colombia, in Argentina, and probably 10 other countries, except those are the ones that we're actually trying to file cases in, or bring amicus briefs or something like that. We view the problem as an international problem. The fact that there are national boundaries doesn't seem to stop everybody from acting just about the same way toward non-human animals. And so as far as non-human animals go, they have the same problem wherever they are. And so we view being involved in a fight in India as just as important as being involved in a fight in New York.
Yeah, that's great. And I would add to that, that I don't know if you've run into this in Colombia yet, but I was just talking to some Colombian lawyers, Steve, and they are really depressed by the fact that their constitution and civil system creates this sort of promise of ecological rights. But now, and largely from US trained lawyers, right? This is one of the things we're exporting. Their lawyers want to, and their government officials want to focus on prosecution, right? So I just had a call with a bunch of lawyers who said, well, they now tell us, like, look, you've got these like American criminal provisions now. Why don't you just prosecute them? Stop talking about all this personhood and these lofty things are meant to be symbolic now. And if you want to do something on the ground, you can prosecute, right? It's really interesting, because that's one of the things we're exporting is our battery cages and a sense of criminal prosecution. Right?
Okay, Mickey, anybody else?
I think we have maybe time for one more question.
Okay.
Let me just take a look here. Sorry. So, okay. Louisa asks, how can someone like myself with a paralegal background become more active in helping in a substantive way?
Steve, you want to answer directly?
Was that how someone who has a paralegal background be able to help?
Yes.
Oh, well, I mean, for us, you can contact us. We may have things that paralegals can do if you want to donate your time, or we can try to hook you up with another organization who needs a work that a paralegal can do. I guess those are the two things that come into mind. We're actually have had a number of lawyers and paralegals and students and come to us over the last years. And by the way, the quality of the people coming to us they're quite powerful. They're very, very good, students, lawyers, and paralegals. So we've been giving them things to do. We're beginning to work with them. So you can use your skills in that way. There may be other organizations that you can work with as well, other than the Nonhuman Rights Project. Just if you're interested in this sort of thing, make sure you're working with organizations who are trying to achieve the goals that you care about.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and say, if you are interested in volunteering with the Nonhuman Rights Project specifically, you can email us at volunteer@nonhumanrights.org. Great.
Is that, are we finished then?
So I think some of these questions might be best answered kind of privately. I feel like there's long answers, great answers to them. Justin, is there a place where people can reach out to you
Sure,
or learn more
you
about
can
your
send,
work?
yeah, of course, and send hate mail that way. I mean, I'm open to everything. I mean, I really do. I mean, I think, I mean, one of the reasons that I like engaging in forums like this is I think we all have to approach these questions with a level of humility, right? We don't know what's going to work. We can look to history, we can look to the future, we can look to what groups are doing. I certainly don't purport to have all the answers. I just try to interrogate different things that are happening with data and say, well, how could we invest? How could we do better? How could we imagine models for change? How do we connect science with law? And I'm always open to hearing from people, and doesn't offend me at all. So my email address is just my initial followed by my last name, jmarceau@law.du.edu. You can also just Google me and send me anything. But I'm always happy to engage, and I actually appreciate the input. So don't feel, you know, like Steve said, you don't need to send me a laundry list of the grievances with DXE or Nonhuman Rights Project or any other group. I believe you, but I'm always happy to engage with ideas.
Great. And Steve, you want to hold up the book one more time?
Yes.
A little plug for Justin. And
You don't need to plug the book.
and also, also we did publish a blog recently with Justin, a full interview, which you can read as well online. And there's the book, Beyond Cages.
Beyond Cages, Animal Law and Criminal Punishment. When I started reading it, I thought, I didn't know any of this. So it's been one of those books that that has really taught me a lot and opened my eyes and made me realize that what we were instinctively doing turned out to be the right thing.
Right. It's glad to affirm. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I really mean it. I'm happy to talk to anybody. Appreciate very much Steve and Lauren the chance to speak with you all, and I hope everybody stays safe and some days gets off of Zoom, someday gets off Zoom and can meet in person too.
And I just want to say, Justin is a terrific lawyer. He's done a lot of work in ag-gag. If you hear him speak, you realize that you're hearing the emanations of a fantastic mind. So
thank you, Steve. You're very kind.
Well, it's true. What can I say? Okay. Thank you one and all for coming. Next Wednesday, Kevin Schneider will be interviewing, I think, someone else. Is that true, Nikki? Is he?
Yes. Next week, same time, Kevin will be interviewing Letitia Maynell.
Letitia Maynell, one of our philosophers, who we have a group of we've had a group of up to 17 North American moral philosophers who have been filing amicus curiae briefs and trying to explain to the judge, while we are saying that the lower court, if we lost, that the lower court was wrong as a matter of law, they've been explaining to the judge why it's a matter of why the lower court was wrong as a matter of ethics and philosophy as well. So it's going to be a great interview. And thank you.
Right.
So
thank you, everyone. Thank you, Justin.
Bye, Justin. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Bye.